Welcome to the Janet Brindle Institute for Ethics at DePaul University. I'm Jeff Dunn, the director of the Brindle Institute, also associate professor of philosophy. We're just really glad to have you here today. The event today is being co-sponsored by several other institutions, so I wanted to recognize those. First, the Association for Practical and Professional Ethics, which is headquartered here at the Brindle Institute. APPE, as they are known, is a membership organization dedicated to advancing scholarship, education, and practice in practical and professional ethics. It's also co-sponsored by Thi Nguyen, a tech company that's proud to support educational events like this that are focused on making sure technology is focused on people, not profit. Created especially for community-based nonprofits, their platform focuses on using technology to build connections between people and causes they trust. They're also proud adopters of the fundraising.ai ethical framework for artificial intelligence. And here at the Brindle Institute, in case you don't know, we aim to provide interactive ethics education for the campus and for the broader community. We help to deepen people's understanding of different world perspectives and learn how to think critically through the inescapable ethical issues that we all face. And today we're going to think through an interesting and fascinating ethical question, I think, of how we can, and maybe whether we should, measure the things that we value. In many fields, from business to higher ed to the nonprofit world, it's very common to rely on metrics. These metrics have a good feature. They keep us honest. They tell us whether or not we're actually achieving the things we said we were going to achieve and doing the things we said we were going to do. But there also may be a downside to this kind of measurement. And those are the kind of questions we're going to ponder today. To think through these questions, I want to just tell you a little bit about the structure of the event. We're going to begin with a keynote address by Thi Nguyen, who I'll introduce in a moment. After the address, we're going to have a panel discussion. It's going to be moderated by the Associate Director of the Brindle Institute and host of our podcast, Christian Weishart, as well as we'll have CEO of United Way of Central Indiana, Payne, and attorney and partner at Creek DeVault, Shelley Jackson. After the panel discussion, we'll have a Q&A where you can get involved in the discussion too. But first, let me introduce our keynote speaker. Thi Nguyen is a philosopher whose intellectual journey has been as diverse as it is interesting. Before joining the academic world, Thi was a food writer for the Los Angeles Times. So if you have questions about that. He now teaches philosophy at the University of Utah and writes about games, technology, and trust. In 2021, he won the American Philosophical Association's prestigious book prize for his first book, Games, Agency as Art. His talk this afternoon explores the ways that our values can be unwittingly shaped by technology and data. So please join me in welcoming Thi Nguyen.
Thanks, Jeff. Is the mic up a little bit? Awesome. Wow. Kings. Wow. Okay. Let me tell you a little bit about how I started thinking about this topic. There are two ways. One, I wrote this book that I was talking about games, and that book is mostly about how amazing games are. I was trying to understand what's special about the games. And if you read a lot of work about games, a lot of it tries to talk about games as a kind of movie. They emphasize the story, the script, the dialogue. But to my mind, they didn't really talk about this weird, special stuff about games. I was trying to understand what was special, and I found this quote from my favorite game. I have a favorite game designer, so Thi. His name is Rainer Knizia. He's the Mozart of German board game design. He's incredible. And he said, the most important thing in my game design toolbox is the scoring system. Because the scoring system tells the players what to care about, right? It tells you to care about money, or killing people, or cooperating, or you're cooperating with these people against those people, right? If you think about how amazing this thing we can do is, you open up a board game, it just tells you what to care about. It literally tells you whether you're working with each other or against each other, and we just do it, right? And so one of the thoughts from the book is that games actually temporarily, radically shape our values. We have this ability to be incredibly fluid, and the thing that takes advantage of that ability is point systems. Someone gives you a point system, you align to it, right? So I was thinking about that a lot. At the same time, I was working a different job at my last university, where I was outcomes assessment liaison for the philosophy department, which meant that I had to justify in quantitative metrics to the Utah State Legislature how well the philosophy department was doing educating students. And one of the things that's really important there is you need a kind of public currency, and you can't say something like, we'll make your students more reflective, we'll make our students more humble. That doesn't count because it's not a kind of it's an institutional hard currency. Things that count, I quickly learned, were things like graduation rate, graduation speed, right? Employment rate afterwards. So those two thoughts have kind of cohered. I'm starting to worry about metrics. And one way to put it, I just want to say this at the outset, since I know a lot of you are nonprofit sector and various institutional sectors, I'm not saying metrics aren't bad. So I'm not saying metrics are all bad. I'm not going to say that metrics don't measure something objective. And I'm certainly not going to say that metrics don't keep us honest. But I'm worried that there are certain kinds of things that are very easy to measure and other kinds of things that are very hard to measure. And the dominance of metrics tends to force us to pay attention to the kinds of things that are very easy to measure on an institutional scale and less attention to really hard things. So just in general, I'm not saying that the metric about which students get jobs doesn't really measure that, but I'm also saying it's kind of hard to measure. Here are some things that are harder to measure. Increasing reflectiveness in students, increasing intellectual humility, open-mindedness, social life, happiness. These are all hard to measure. And one of the things that I've been really worried about is right now, a lot of universities are using student success algorithms, machine learning algorithms, to help pick which students to admit. And those are trained to target student success. Here's the thing. You can't train those models on student happiness, joy, or ability, because that data doesn't exist. You can train those models on drop-off rates and retention rate, because that data exists. Makes sense? So that's kind of like where we're at. So I'm going to be particularly worried about the case in which we internalize those values. When they're not just kind of external metrics that we pay attention to, we start caring directly about the rankings, the scores. So let me tell you a quick story. This is a true story. This is something I got from my mother-in-law. So she and her husband, Tom, were going for a vacation in Rome. They were tired. And they were going to see their old friends, John and Shelley. And they were really excited to see them. They used to live together in Wyoming. John and Shelley moved away. They hadn't seen them much for 10 years. They got to spend the week together. And Chris was so excited. And then she said, the entire vacation was basically shaped by John and Shelley's relationship to their Fitbits. Right? John and Shelley would say things like, oh, we were planning on dinner, but we can't come to dinner. We haven't met our step goals. So you have dinner, we're going to keep walking. Or they'd say things like, we can't go to the opera because there aren't enough steps at the opera. So we're going to do a walking tour instead. Right? So this is the kind of thing I'm super interested in. And one way to put it is, the Fitbit definitely helps them meet their step goals. Yeah. But the thing I'm really interested in is that in this case, something that happened was they didn't try to target seeing art or spending time with their friends because there wasn't an art bit and there wasn't a friend bit, right? Does that make sense? So I'm not saying steps aren't valuable. I'm worried that the easiness to measure of steps and the watch makes them swamp other values that we also have that are harder to measure and for which there aren't ready-made technologies. That's the general work. And one way to put it is that when you have a ready-made measure, that often just speaks a little louder in your brain. So I don't think what happened with John and Shelley was that they decided steps are more important to me than spending time with friends, right? It's just that there's this thing that was measured, and there's a thing that was not measured. And the measure was really accessible, and that just kind of speaks a little bit louder in everything. Right? That's what I So let me put my worries into a term. So I'm gonna worry about an effect I'm gonna call value capture. So value capture is a case where you have values that are rich and subtle or in the process of forming, and then you get put in an institution, and an institution gives you clear, simple, typically quantified metrics, a clear, simplified rendition of those values, and that takes over how you reason, right? You go to school out of education in Woodtown, you come out carrying with GPA school ranks, right? I think this also happens to institutions, so I'm really worried that institutions have larger missions and then get obsessed with ROI or in academic cases like getting the most grants, right? I mean, we're super interested in cases where people trade off what they actually care about versus the kind of research that will get them, or work that will get them more grants. So those are like countable. For example, you start trying to exercise for your health, and you end up trying to max out your Fitbit per week numbers, or reduce your BMI. Or you go to philosophy grad school to the love of truth. This is true, and you come out obsessed. There's a ranking of journals inside philosophy where everyone knows what the number one highly status journal is and the number two is, and everyone cares about getting into the highest ranked journal. When you start tweeting, this is really worrisome for me. I wrote a book about this. You start tweeting because you want to connect to people, or you love justice, and you start instead caring about likes. Right? So that's value capture. So, and this is a little, so people talk about perverse incentives. This is a little bit different from perverse incentives. So perverse incentives are damaging incentives, but when people worry about perverse incentives, they're mostly worried about an external incentive, like you'll get money if you do this thing. I'm worried about the next case where you internalize, right? You just start to care about the ranking, the next that becomes the core of your value. There's a great example of value capture from this book, an incredible book, Engine Anxiety by Wendy Esplin and Micah Sauger. They're sociologists, and this book is a history of what the US News and World Report law school rankings did to legal culture, and what they say is completely transformed it. Beforehand, law schools used to have very different missions that they pursued genuinely. Some did more community outreach, some did more corporate work, some did more research work. And what they say is the moment the rankings came out, every institution was basically forced to pursue the rankings, because if they dropped to the rankings, they would lose donations and lose students. And so they were kind of pushed, right? But by the way, what I want to say so far, I find this really interesting that the ranking seems to drive a plurality of values out of the space. But what I've talked so far just looks like an incentive. But they also talk about something else that they documented quite clearly. So they said that before the rankings, students going to law school, the process of figuring out what law school to go to would trigger this like complex process of deliberation. Different law schools had different missions and represented different values. And the students would have to ask themselves whether they cared more about ethical work, social work, or making money, or doing research. What they say is, when the rankings came out, within a year, students stopped deliberating about what they cared about their law school education and what their goals were, and instead simply took their goal to be to go to the best school, where best was just set by the USU goal report. By the way, this research is possible because a lot of this stuff happened in the early days of the internet on online forums for students, and all that stuff is archived. So this is like archival work that they've done. It's incredible. So that's value capture for me. The students change what their value is. So let me translate that into philosopher's terms. So I think it's really important often to determine what your values are for yourself, to figure out what you care about. And value capture disrupts value determination. You should be choosing your values and tailoring them to yourself, to your place in the world, and value capture cuts off that process and substitutes a prefabricated and standardized value for a tailor. And that's your. And I also, by the way, I think it says we're not just talking about communities, we're not just talking about people, we're talking about communities. I'm worried, for example, about universities that used to care about research and now care about who gets the most grants, right? Or or newspapers that used to care about newsworthiness, now care about clicks and reading. We're worried about those. So the main idea of the slogan is with value capture, an agent, a person or a group is outsourcing the process of value self-determination. They're outsourcing their values. And specifically in a lot of these cases, they're outsourcing their values to Facebook or Tap, right? Does this make sense? This is kind of what I want to say. In many cases, in one of these cases, when you adopt one of these metrics as your goal, you're outsourcing your value to like Elon Musk, right? You're letting Elon Musk tell you what to care about via technology. That's the point. So let me give you an example. So I used to be super, super sedentary. I hated exercise. I was like, I'm a philosopher, life of the mind. And then my body was falling apart and it hurt all the time. So I decided I had to exercise. In the beginning of this process, my understanding of what exercise was for was very naive. I thought it was you pound out miles on a treadmill to burn calories. That's all I thought it was. And I came to realize from years that there's all kinds of things you get out of exercise. And then different exercises give you different things. So long distance running is really zen-like, trail running is really aesthetically complicated, ultramarathoning is grueling and hardcore and like kind of a mind-altering drug, from what I understand. I became a rock climber, which is actually very intellectually pleasurable. They're like little logic puzzles that you solve with your body. And I realized what you're kind of doing when you're working through this space is you're kind of discovering the value in different activities and seeing how they fit you. What I found was that long distance running, that kind of value experience didn't fit me particularly well, but rock climbing fit me particularly well, right? But even inside an activity, you can change the way you do it. Some rock climbers do it for beauty and adventure, some do high risk stuff. I do bouldering, which is I chill out on a crash pad with my friends drinking beer and whiskey, and then when I feel like it, I try to do a really hard 8-foot climb on a basically cave roof, and it hurts, and it takes 20 seconds, and I fall off, and everyone makes fun of me, and then I drink more beer. That suits me really well, right? That fits me. So here's the worry. If you're value captured by Fitbit, you adopt the stated value within Fitbit rather than navigating the terrain and finding a version that fits. That make sense? Like you would skip this entire process of tailoring. By the way, I'm not saying that you put on a Fitbit and it automatically happens. You can just trigger this information, right? You can also, and this is really important, try it on for a while and then see if Fitbit life suits you. That's still being under control. The thing that I'm worried about is the case if you put it on and you're just captured and directed by the value as stated on Fitbit and you don't do any tailoring to yourself. That's the worry about value. So my claim, again, isn't you should never outsource your value. I actually outsource my values all the time. Whenever I need an appliance, I call my dad, who still subscribes to Consumer Reports. He tells me, I can do like washing machines. I just want to stop washing machines. I don't give a shit about washing machines. It's not that important to me. But it seems a bigger deal outsourcing your values and education, your job, your fitness. And that seems much more important. So what I'm saying is not you should never outsource your values. I'm saying there's a cost, okay? And the cost is the cost of outsourcing. So the outsourcing metaphor I can really strongly here. Outsourcing is efficient, but it gives you standardized goods that aren't adapted to you. They're cheap and quick, and I often use standardized goods. I outsource a lot of stuff in my life, right? What I'm saying is there's a cost. In some cases, that cost is not worth paying. And the more close we are to the realm of core values for you or your community, the more unlikely it is to be worth paying that cost. I'm going to switch to material because I'm running. I'm going slow today. So one way to put it is that when you get to value capture, you skip value deliberation and tailoring. You get a pre-made system of evaluation made by somebody else that's already embedded in various tracking systems, reward systems, communication systems. What you're giving up is the fine control of your values and seeing whether they fit your place. A lot of values, by the way, for groups. I just want to be clear. There's some great examples of this. I think this also happens at the group level, where different values. So I think, actually, let me go back. I see the crucial part. So Elijah Milton is this great way of putting it. He's a philosopher. And he thinks that when you figure out what your values are, you're not just doing the top down by looking at some abstract thing, something really good, and deducing what right is. What you're doing is you're trying on values and you're seeing how they fit. And you see that certain ones fit you well. And one of the ways you can tell is your life goes well. You're engaged, you're interested. If you're bored, if you're miserable, that's a sign that the values, the goals, the roles you've adopted just don't fit to a midlife crisis. Right? Communities can also get this. Jane Jacobs, who has this incredible urban planning book, The Rise and Fall of Great American Cities, has a great example of this. She says that a lot of times people move from a rural area to a crowded city, and they have this value that came from a rural area of friendliness and eye contact. And they try to make eye contact with everybody, they see everyone. When they find out that if you try to do that in New York, it's a little crazy, because there are too many people, right? Does that make sense? In New York, what people adopt as a value of privacy, you don't make eye contact. You don't look at people, look at your phone, look at your book. And the reason is because there are so many people that it'll drive you completely out of your mind if you try to make eye contact with everyone. So we have to adapt our values to our context. And part of the claim here is simply that value capture exposes you to values that are made at large-scale institutions that aren't adapted to the particular context of you, your personality, your place, your community's particular needs and place in the world. Here's the motto. If you want a TED Talk motto, here it is. Value should be tailored to you. With value capture, you buy them off the rack. Actually, it's worse, because you buy off the rack clothes and tailor them. You can't tailor a bit unless you have a lot more technology knowledge than I do. Here's a big question. Is this just inevitable? Is this just an accident? Is it continued? What I want to claim is there's a strong relationship between what institutional metrics are and why they're so damaging to us. So it's crucial here to understand the forces that shape institutional metrics. And here there's this really great field, STS, Science and Technology Studies, that has spent 20 to 30 years studying how institutional metrics work. And the key text of this is Theodore Torter's Trust in Numbers. So he's a historian who's influenced by a lot of philosophers. He ends up saying that there's a deep difference between quantitative and qualitative knowledge. So qualitative knowledge, he says, is rich and subtle and nuanced, but it travels really badly between contexts. Right? It's hard for people to understand the value of language. Quantitative knowledge, what quantitative knowledge is in institutions is you strip off the stuff that's context variable, and you create a context invariant nugget. Then everyone can collect into that data, and that data can aggregate and travel. Easiest example, student evaluations. I can write which qualitative evaluations my students are tailored to them. We talk about all kinds of different dimensions. But my philosophy evaluations will be incomprehensible to the business team. I actually know this. Check. No idea what they mean. Grades are simple. Does that make sense? Grades are a simple scale that eliminates all this nuance, but in exchange, they're aggregable and collectible and understandable across the community. Does that make sense? So one way to put it is, think about everything a teacher can tell you that is not in the grades. That is the kind of qualitative nuance that's lost in quantitative work, but that stuff does not travel, cannot aggregate. Right? So this is the essential trade-off between qualitative and institutionally quantitative knowledge for Porter. He thinks that both are very powerful, but his worry is that they're powerful for different things. His worry is that we've gone too large-scale quantitative and lost the value of the qualitative stuff. So one way to put it is he thinks that he has this great one where it's information. And this phrase, I think, means what Will Brown called data, is a kind of knowledge that's prepared to travel to and be understood by distant strangers that share no context. And that's a very powerful tool, but it also involves shaving off any context dependent information that requires being really steeped in that situation. Well in time. I'm gonna skip a little bit to get to the next case. I do want to talk about this a little bit. So one way, what the root of this is the data collection procedure, and there's a really good account of this in this book from Bowker and Starr that sorting things out. So what Bowker and Starr said is that every data collection effort requires categories to collect information into, and every category cuts up a complex space into a simpler number of buckets, and those buckets emphasize what's at the boundary of the buckets and forget what's inside the bucket. So for example, think about the US Census race categories, right? Those categories highly emphasize the difference between Black, Latino, and Asian, but they forget the difference between East Asian and South Asian, right? Instead, there aren't kind of categories for those. So one way to put it, they say, is that every classification system, which remember is the root of all data collection systems, right? Every classification system is an institutionalized decision about what to remember and what to forget. And we have to forget stuff because there's too much information to collect. But what they say is, every decision about a classification system is made for some social or political or value purpose. It embeds a value in it about what you care about and what you don't. And then we forget there was a contingent thing made for a purpose when it enters information infrastructure. It just becomes part of our natural world. So they have this great example that they look at they look at the World Health Organization's mortality. So mortality statistics are really important for any kind of medical work. And they looked at the WHO's mortality statistics manual for classifications of causes of death. One of the things they note is there are hundreds of different categories of slightly different heart disease and hundreds of different categories of slightly different cancer. But there's one category for death by insect bite and one category called tropical disease. You can quickly ask yourself, who made this category? whose interest does it serve and whose interest does it not serve? Right? H.E. pretty clear. So, okay, I want to try to get through this level of common material. So one of the things I'm saying here isn't that metrics are bad. It's that metrics are made to serve institutional scale. They travel well. They're very powerful because they travel well. But in order to travel well, they have to be exposed to forces of standardized categorization and forces of de-nuanced decontextualization. Does that make sense? So the worry is, specifically, it's not that metrics are bad, but it's not good to internalize as your values metrics made for a larger scale, right? My claim isn't don't use metrics. It's that don't take as your core values metrics that are made to serve the needs of the World Health Organization. Right? The World Health Organization has a perfectly good reason to use those metrics, right? Not you. I'm going to do a quick case study. I think it's our little lab. We will do a quick case study. I think particularly, this is a particular place to see this clearly is the case of metrics or the case of transparency. I'm doing this partially because I know there are a lot of people here from institutional development of the nonprofit sector. So if you're interested, this is one paper of mine called Transparency and Surveillance. You can probably figure out what to say. Title. Here we go. So Onara O'Neill, who's a bioethicist, wrote this. She said, transparency can encourage people to be less honest. She basically said, people in her world, in bioethics, tended to assume that transparency and trust went together, and more transparency and more trust. And she said they were actually opposed. And what she said was that transparency asked doctors to explain themselves and to act as if they're always being watched by other people. But because they know not everyone will understand their decisions, they will make up false reasons. The transparency encourages falsehood. One way to put the argument is this. People think trust and transparency go together, but here's the tension. Transparency demands, so by the way, I'm talking about public transparency to the general public. Transparency demands that experts explain their reasoning to non-experts, but by definition, not all expert reasons are available to non-experts. This is the essential bias. I just saw a bunch of people look up in horror because this is I don't like this argument, by which I mean I believe it, but this would be very uncomfortable. Okay, so think about this, right? Learn to be an expert, to understand things to other people. What transparency asks is to justify your reasoning to a public, a rushed and quick public. You cannot as an expert. By definition, transparency efforts are going to fail at some level. O'Neill thinks they're going to force deception because experts will fake their reasons and write down fake reasons. I think once you increase monitoring, experts are going to change what they do. And sometimes they'll change what they do and limit themselves to actions that can be justified to a broader public, right? And sometimes they will simply take on board the public metrics as their goals. And to this extent, transparency undermines expertise. Did I jump? That's the word. Here's a case study for Shelley Jackson. Let me give you two. Shelley Jackson is an anthropologist who is a specialist in human rights, and she was part of the World Health Organization's development of various human rights ranking indices. And in this book, she turns around and applies her anthropologist's eye to the UN committees. And she basically shows you how the sausage is made on the various large-scale rankings. It's totally horrifying. She has this example. By the way, let me just point out, this is a side note. I see this all over the place, quantification based. Mary just points out this, she says it's really clear, she wants to say at the outset, that metrics really help. Also, and she notes that every case she's ever looked at, when an institution was deeply racist and deeply sexist, that what moved the needle in the beginning was clear metrics. It said, look, 99% of the people in your company are white men. What's going on? That's what moved the needle in the beginning. And in every single case she looked at, when people started these processes, the people that were trying to diversify institutions said, but whatever we do, we should not end up turning this into a simple quota system. And she says, 20 years later, you revisit these institutions, and almost all of them, what you find is that the diversity effort becomes a simple quota system. That's the arc that really is, right? And I think that arc really captures something. The metric is what absolutely moves the needle in the beginning. The metric is what 20 years later becomes some kind of simplified thing that misses the heart of what's going on. I see people going. I was also in charge of a diversity effort at a large-scale national organization, and I co-signed this statement. Here's an example of merit that's really compelling. So there's a worldwide sex trafficking index that measures how much sex trafficking occurs in countries. But sex trafficking is incredibly hard to measure. A lot of it is invisible, right? It's also actually really hard to define sex trafficking clearly. Mary gives this example. Say that a woman who is starving crosses a border and works in a brothel to survive. The next year, she brings her friend who's also starving across the border. Does this woman count as an international sex trafficker? Really hard. Busted, right? So what the State Department does is it ignores questions of trying to count the sex trafficking incidents and only looks at convictions of sex traffickers. That's easy to count. That interests the legal system. But it's completely different measure. It doesn't measure the right thing. It's very simple as UI. One way to get rid of sex trafficking typically occurs in highly populated areas. If you increase ambient wealth, sex trafficking goes away, but convictions drop. Make sense? So if you increase the wealth in an area, actual sex trafficking will go down, but you look on the index like you're performing worse because there's no one to convict anyway, because you've got rid of non-policing now. Here, people are going, oh, here's the problem. That index looks good to the untrained eye, right? To the inexpert eye, that looks like a good index. You have to be an expert in the case area, understand or have explained to you why. Here's another case study. This is for the nonprofit people. For a long time, there is something called Charity Navigator that I use in my classes. The Charity Navigator rated charities on their effectiveness, and for many years, their primary effectiveness score was something called the throughput rate, which is the number of donations made to the charity that made it through to the other side. This was intended to increase efficiency and decrease overhead. Looks like a great measure. I used it in my classes for 8 years. Turns out, everyone in this space who was ruled by Charity Navigator said it's a terrible metric because it forced nonprofits to cut costs. It reduced internal overhead, which means they couldn't hire enough internal staffing, experts, legal help. It's a terrible measure, but it looks good to the outside. So it's an apparently good metric, but it turns out to be really blunt. I just want to say here, to be really clear, I'm not saying there's the one class of experts over here who are the holy people, and there's the rest of the stupid people. We should be ruled. That's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying, and I think this is the most important thing I have to say to it, is the world is so complicated that no one can understand it all, and everyone is an expert in one tiny thing and not an expert in everything else. So as an aggregate, the public is not expert in anything. Because the world is incredibly complex. So when you pose a method and it's supposed to be comprehensible to the public, what you will get is ruled by non-experts over experts. And by definition, they won't understand the full reason. So this is, by the way, supposed to be a particular example of one case of kind of decontextualizing I was talking about, where expertise is the come. Let me just give you the argument. It's super simple. Expertise often requires acting from reasons that are not available to non-experts. Some of these are explicit reasons, and a lot of them are tacit knowledge. So most of the studies are still in that a lot of expertise is when you become expert, you just look and see, like doctors, they see who's sick immediately, right? An emergency room doctors is seeing who's not breathing well in a moment. Public transparency on expert processes demands that experts take only those actions for which they can give public justification, and this limits them to actions which can be justified in non-expert terms. By the way, for the philosophers in the room, I take this argument to be trivially simple, nothing Christian at all. I also find it to be horrifying. So take that for what you will. And this is not an argument that this is because there's some doubt. This is an argument that this is the essential logic of transparency. Transparency is explaining yourself to non-experts. Right? That's what it's supposed to do. I'm almost out of time. So I'm going to skip a little bit to the end. So here's a big worry. There's a big tension between transparency practice and respect for expertise. In some sense, what this is based on, like underneath, is this old belief It came from some philosophers like Descartes, that you should be intellectually autonomous, that you should think for yourself, that everyone should be able to understand everything is, minister everything, and figure out whether other people are reasoning well or not. And I think that's the fact. We are now in a world where the basic fact, Elijah Milgram, the philosopher a second before, puts it this way. The essential fact of the modern world is the world is hyper-specialized, and you cannot understand all the expertises that your life depends on, that you engage with on a daily basis, right? So there's a tension between the center of intellectual autonomy, which expects every person to be able to value for themselves, every intellectual development, and that's impossible. The transparency is often that fantasy written into public policy. One way to put it is that transparency is a kind of surveillance. So what we know is surveillance is heightened attention, paid says the possibility of bad action. The transparency is a kind of bureaucratic surveillance. And what we know, I think, is that surveillance, when you think about in terms of surveillance, I think we know that surveillance is sometimes justified when the costs and risks are high enough. But you don't want surveillance over everything all the time. And one of my worries is if the transparency culture we're in is moving towards surveillance all the time. So here's what we do about it. There's this realm that's hidden from public oversight. And that is absolutely where bias hides and corruption thrives, but it's also where expert skill resides and special sensitivities flourish and intimacy lives and transparency gets rid of it all simultaneously. So my claim is that transparency is bad. My claim is basically like transparency is like chemo. It's really hard. It's a very high cost. It's sometimes worth it. But you don't want to give to everyone all the time. So here's another way to put it. The world is radically hyper-specialized. Most kinds of expertise are not available to most people. And you need to trust because there are all these kinds of expertise that are out of your ken. And as the philosopher Annette Biter puts it, trust puts you in a position of basic vulnerability. One response is to try to get rid of that vulnerability, to get the experts who are acting out of our sight back into our sight and make them explain themselves to us all the time, but that imposes on the experts a limitation of only doing the kinds of things that public would understand, which surprises with their expertise. So a world dominated by public metrics is a world where we limited trust in experts. And that's not a world when you can captivate a word knowledge is larger than one person. Yeah. So what's the solution? Are you ready? There you go. There's no solution. The trust between transparency is deep. There's no answer. There's only a painful trade-off between monitoring for corruption and trusting in expertise. And we have to painfully choose where that slider goes in every case. That's it.
Hi, so while they're working with their mics, I would like to introduce myself again. So I'm Krisha Weishart. I am the Associate Director of Content here at the Prindle Institute. I also host the Examining Ethics podcast. And if you'd like Thi's talk today and want more from him, we have 2 episodes with him. So you can find those wherever you find your podcasts. You can also find them on our website as well. So we'll get started with the panel discussion, but I want to introduce our 2 other finalists first. Shelley Jackson is a partner at Creed DeVault LLP and leads the firm's labor and employment practice. Her areas of expertise include employment law, health law, and data privacy and security. Ms. Jackson previously served as in-house counsel and chief privacy officer for a multinational corporation. Frank Payne is CEO of United Way of Central Indiana. He previously served as commissioner of the Indiana Department of Workforce Development. He was recognized as one of Indiana's 250 most influential leaders by the Indianapolis Business Journal and is considered an expert on workforce and employment topics. So I'm super excited to have the 3 of you here because I think you each bring something really unique to the conversation about metrics and values and data collection and privacy. So Shelley, I was hoping you could help us do some stage setting first, though. Help us understand what our current context is when it comes to data collection and privacy, like just how much are corporations and nonprofits collecting data about us. Thank you so much. I'm excited to be here. I'm honored to be on this panel today. So I would love to offer a few comments, but I'm really looking forward to listening as well. To go to your question, I think I'd say buckle up, right? In terms of what data is being collected about us and used and processed in a variety of ways, I did a little bit of, I was trying to look for some statistics, broad-based statistics that just talks about how much data is out there that's being processed about us, that is being collected from us. We had the great example of the Fitbit dilemma that is constantly collecting the steps that we take, where we go, what we're doing in different contexts. And it turns out that that number is measured in what is called zettabytes, which I had never heard of before. To give you some context, that is 10 to the 21st power of bytes. So if that tells you, I mean, we're talking about massive amounts of data, and that has grown exponentially over the last 10 to 20 years. We're talking about our world gaining data and knowledge and information about individuals that didn't even exist before. There was no concept of collecting it. So I think it's safe to say that data is being collected about us every moment of every day in every possible way that you can imagine. Anytime we watch on even the news, for example, and there's an attempt to try and retrace steps of someone who is either being sought or has been suspected of being involved in a particular situation or incident or is missing, when you look at what is able to be pretty easily reconstructed about an individual, even if they're not wearing a Fitbit, it tells you that we have organizations at every level and of every type that are collecting information about us. So that's the starting point, is that I don't think we as humans have an ability to conceive of exactly how much data is out there and it's being processed. I think also when we consider this conversation, and this is something that I've spent the last several years sort of immersing myself in from both the context of a chief privacy officer whose goal it was and whose responsibility it was to think about how data was being used, and then also as a lawyer that's advising entities on how to use that data. We're looking at legal and regulatory frameworks that are really all over the chart, right? So we have sort of the idea of global regulation of data privacy. And data privacy is something separate from the, let's say the technology advances that allow us to capture and process data. It really relates to if there is data that's created about me, do I have a right to own that data in some respect? Or at the very least, do I have the right to control how that data is used about me? So when we think about it from that context, we have really both a global discussion that is being led by certain parts of the globe. I would say, for example, the Europeans' adoption of the General Data Protection Regulation, I would consider in the data privacy space to be one of the forefront comprehensive considerations about data as a whole. Here in the United States, we have made some strides in particular areas of regulation. For example, highly regulated entities like healthcare entities, entities that are dealing with financial institution entities, for example, student privacy. That's an area where we have very specific regulatory frameworks, but largely consumer data and that general data that's collected about us has been highly unregulated. And so we have a legal and regulatory framework that kind of jumps into the fray here, and it is transforming the way that organizations use data. But that transformation is slow, particularly here in the United States. It's taken a long time to essentially agree upon this framework and the value discussion. This is a fascinating discussion. The idea of valuing the data is specific to the type of data that we're collecting, I think is a conversation that's actually happening in that legal and regulatory framework as well, the compliance framework. So it is yet another element to consider when you're thinking about use of data. But yes, it's very broad-based and wide-ranging, I would say. Thank you so much. That was super helpful, because one of the things that I was worried about when I was reading your paper, reading your work, is like, well, what about me? Like, they're reducing me, this complex human being, to steps, and what I buy and what I look at online, right? And I'm particularly worried about that in terms of how like nonprofits maybe measure communities. So I'm going to put you on the spot, Brad, and ask you a question about United Way. But I think it's a sort of general question for nonprofits in general too. So on the United Way's website, you can find the following statement. United Way's commitment to data and research is rooted much deeper than grant compliance. We believe it's the best way to build our collective knowledge around who's being served, what strategies are most effective, and how we can better support more individuals and families to attain social and economic mobility. That seems reasonable to me. That seems like a reasonable justification for data collection. I worked and volunteered at nonprofits. I know the value of data. But I wanted to ask you, how do you balance like a respect for privacy and complexity of individuals with serving the public good? And I want you to start, and then I guess you can respond whenever you'd like.
Yeah, I think that's a great question. Before I get to that, I wanted to, as you were talking about the Fitbit earlier, I no longer wear my Apple Watch because it started telling me what to do. And I realized that it was capturing more data about me than I really wanted to know about myself. So I left it. Now mine gets to have a phone. But I just thought I had to start off with that. I tried to limit the data because I didn't want it telling me what to do, because it was using that data in a way that I didn't want it to use, like telling me to stand up when I didn't want to stand up. You could tell me type when I meant to sleep. One of the things that we do at United Way is we do collect data. Okay, but I want to start off by saying that we want to make sure that we're collecting data so that it drives how we perform in terms of what we're investing. The data is never a substitute for the value of the person. We want to make sure that our value is always centered on the people that deserve our view. So that is one of the reasons why it's important for us to capture data about whole communities, so it will help us direct resources to help individuals so that their value is uplifted. So we balance a lot of this of what we do with the data, how we collect the data, by really understanding that our value is the value of the person that we're serving. So I wanted to make sure we start off with just that. And one of the ways that we try to balance the community needs with qualitative data and quantitative data, because we do need data to help us to do our work, right? There is also probably a bigger disservice if we didn't collect the data, because we wouldn't know where to send or provide the research. We may not know what areas are high crime. We may not know the areas where there is more poverty or less education. So we need data to help tell us those things about communities. That's sort of the quantitative side, how many people in certain areas have a high student vote versus how many people in that same area or living below the federal poverty. But it's not about an individual person, it's about full community. So we get that aggregate. So we try to balance that with how does this resource that we have, how can we direct it to help those particular communities? So when we think about collecting the data, there are some things that we make sure that we use as sort of guideposts for what we collect. The data that we collect is always based upon what we're trying to do with it and what needs and what services we're trying to provide for the community. So for example, and I'm going to go out on the experiment here. We don't need to know how much a person paid for a car, right? We don't need to know, whether or not there's an accident, because of some kind of transmission issue. We don't need to know that. It doesn't drive what we do. But we do want to know how many people in a particular community have their maybe lights turned off, their electricity turned on. It may help us know what the value of the need is to that particular community. So if it isn't tied to the services that we provide, it's data that we try to make sure that we're not collecting from our community-based organizations, because it doesn't drive what we do, and it doesn't equate to the value of the person. Now, when I also go before an automotive company, that particular data was necessary because it would help save lives and it would help us to, make a better vehicle, make a better mobility machine. So that data
I want to make sure I drew those big comparisons and contrasts between, what organizations are pulling the data that they need and the data that's kept. So we try to make sure that we can balance everything, the value of the person, also based upon what resources that we need to provide to a community. That's how we end up getting the data. But the data integrity piece that we never provide or sell data to other entities, right? We want to make sure that we're protecting that. So we want to balance the qualitative piece, and how is it actually helping that person who actually needs services that we provide. So that comes with the outcomes of conflict.
I was listening and hearing so many elements of your response that really drill down into the key conversation we're having around data privacy, the identification. I heard you talking about that. I heard you talking about purpose-driven decisions about data. What do we need? Why do we need it? And in what capacity and scope do we need it? So I think what the friend has just done in talking about how United Way is thinking of the use of this data is exactly the conversation that is happening in that compliance space. And the question is, number one, are we creating empowered situations for organizations to come to the data that they need so that they can make important decisions? When you think about an organization like United Way of Central Indiana or any other organization that is doing big things in our community, they need to be able to know where to position those resources. Because in terms of building those resources over time, it is important to know, is this working here? I would imagine there's times where there needs to be a shift in resources. So one of the things that is part of the conversations that I have in this space with organizations, both really nonprofit and for-profit, there's often a very similar type of conversation. My first question, the way it comes to me a lot of times is there's this new privacy law and we need to know what to do and we're a little freaked out and we're not sure if we're compliant. In fact, we know we're not compliant. What do we do next? My first question is always, what data are you collecting? Whose data are you collecting? What are you doing with that data? Are you disclosing to third parties? If you're disclosing to third parties, why are you doing that? For what purpose? What's happening there? What does your data flow look like? In other words, how is that data coming to you? Is it something that's reported individually? In Fred's answer, I heard him talking about he's gathered data sometimes from third parties that would gather that data from maybe government sources or some other type of information collected practices. So you think about that. Are you collecting it directly from the individual that the data is about? Or are you collecting de-identified data, aggregated data that may have come from other sources? And I think being intentional about that and sort of thinking of the life cycle of the data itself can help from a compliance perspective, thinking kind of in that legal and regulatory place. Because, and I will also say I keep referring to that just because that's the world that I live in terms of how do we make sure that that use of data is not going to trigger some sort of a problem, you're not in compliance with X law. But I think there's a larger issue there, right? It gets to being intentional about the use of data. One of the things that's kind of been an interesting part of this area of practice, sometimes we find out that an entity may be collecting data and it didn't know that it was collecting that data. Because we have very sophisticated technology pieces that can collect a lot of data. And I will tell you, sometimes if you're using any tools, if you're using tools to make decisions, this automated decision-making tools, algorithms, go tool around on your dashboard and find out what's available in there. You can find out all kinds of things, surprising things sometimes. And so I think that's the other piece too, is helping to empower organizations to know what data are they using, where are they getting it from, who is it about, why do they need it, but also what is the scope of their data collect? What do they have in their organizations?
So yeah, I wanted to know. I just wanted to know if you, Fred, or you, Shelley, in your community work, if you notice this problem with value capture playing out, right? Where because this metric is easy to understand and analyze, we're going to go ahead and use it. And obviously it's not that simple. I just wanted to know, Brent, you said you stopped using your Apple Watch because it was telling you what to do, right? Are there instances where there are certain data sets where you're like, gosh, we were using that to make this certain decision. Maybe that's not quite the way to go. It's not ever happened in your work.
Yeah. It happens in a variety of ways. Okay. One, sometimes the easy to capture data is the data that you can really make some quick, easy decisions about. So it may not be data that we don't need to capture because it's so easy, but it can help us make an easy decision and is readily available, and it can inform other decisions. And sometimes that data will let us know, you know what, this really isn't working. So now to your that about that. We've been evaluating data in our organization for quite some time. Over the past year, we had sort of a change. We put all of our data researchers and all of our data team underneath one pending so that they have a different purview and a different outlook over things, and they can engage in a different type of way so we can look at how we use data a little different, right? And so we've now found some data that we've looked at that may not be that we want to use a little different. I'll give you a real life example of some data that we captured. It's really on how our donors provide their resources. Sometimes we look at just the number of people who give, and then the number of people who stop it, right? That's an easy number to capture, right? But the true number, what tells us a little bit more, is when people stop giving and why they stop giving. So you have a quantitative piece that might be a year and months or years engaged involved. So that tells us a number. But then the why. And part of the why could be, well, the person retire and they move to another community. They're still giving, but they're giving to a community that's in Utah. That's not in Indianapolis because that's what they retired to. That tells us. But when we look at just the pure numbers, it just tells us a number. It's sort of, it's easy to capture because it's, these are the people skip. It's a number. But when we start looking a little deeper, it can tell us in different kind of sort. So there have been instances where it's not that we won't capture it, but it helps us to analyze it in a different type of way than an app before. And then we also have to evaluate, whether or not the burden of capturing some of that data, is it really worth us capturing it because we have to spend our time and our resources somewhere else? Not that it's unimportant. It's just that the way that we want to use our resources may be a little bit different. And when we look at that situation, and the data to tell us that it helped us to make that decision.
A lot of the stuff that you're saying is, I think, not opposed to the stuff I was saying at all, but I just wanted to point out some of this is a good place to talk about some of the slippage between scale. So, does anyone here know J. Scott's Focusing Like State? This is my favorite book in the last 50 years. So what Scott says is, so he talks about entities called states, and states is basically any large-scale bureaucratically organized institution. It's like governments, corporations, large all that stuff. And he says that there are parts of the world that states can see easily, and that's the part of the world which can be easily collected into large-scale actable. They don't. And there are parts of the world that states can see into very core, and that's the parts of the world that aren't easily collected. And I think, in some sense, and he's not saying it's that. He thinks that states, when you're operating that scale, that the way what you need to see everything that's going on is to be able to aggregate information from across all of your pieces. So I think I was just listening to Brett talk and being like, I can see how this works out. Here's what maybe this will be a hostile characterization, but or not. But it sounds good like you're saying, here's the thing that we can easily see. We can see a restaurant. These kinds of things.
then you might think there's other kinds of stuff that is hard to see at the scale of a corporate or non-content factor. And the thought that I had was just something like, not that institutions shouldn't gather data, but that as individuals, you shouldn't internalize that stuff down to your scale. Because let me just try one example. Here's a super interesting example, BMI. So body mass index, right? So BMI is a really approximate measure, and it turns out that BMI is super inaccurate as a measure of health or anything else for an individual. It's actually incredibly accurate and useful as a public health measure. Does this make sense? So BMI, body mass index, is a poor indicator of health for a person, but at the scale of, say, the World Health Organization, when you see an entire country's BMI go up by 30%, you know something's going on, right? Or when you see certain areas in the country start to have mass changes in BMI, that's when you start looking for things like food deserts, right? Or tattoo spots. So this thought makes sense. It is both the case that BMI is a very good thing for large-scale health monitoring organizations, because there's not anything else they could have that they have easy access to. It does give them information at massive scale, but it's also not good for individuals to care too much about BMI. Does that make sense? So the thing I'm talking about is a little bit of a slippage between what I think, especially what I was talking about. I think, does that make sense? I think it's just super interesting that the worry I have is almost like a scale worry, right? But what works at large scale or what's necessary at large scale isn't always what is best at tiny scales. A lot of us, I think, one of the things I love most is about the comment thread is, I think it is, in your comments, I saw something like both acknowledging that you have a role as the head of a large scale institution, and then you need data. And then as an individual, you're not going to wear that watch because the watch is treated. Maybe one way to put it is, F.A. Hayek, who was a real economist, one of the founders of libertarianism and a really interesting thinker that came from a pretty political side should be correct. One of the things he said is that large-scale data collection efforts can never see you, the individual. They can only see average individuals. And they can never treat you as an individual. They can only treat average individuals. And so those are tools that are actually, I think, you're going to hear, super useful for a large-scale organization trying to figure out which communities to send resources to, and also can feel really intrusive. That's used directly to tell you when to go to sleep as an individual, right? But that scales stuff. You did? As you were talking, I was reminded of something that everyone has either read or they've seen or they've heard about, that gets two sort of contrasting examples of data that's been reported in both DC. That makes a lot of sense on the surface, but then when you are in the field, you're in that space, you see that it means something different. So how many of you in the room have heard of the unemployment rate? Yes, sir. Okay. So we know the higher the unemployment rate, more people aren't working, and that's a bad number, right? And so we've also heard that, probably we want a low unemployment because that means more people are working. Okay. So our state highest unemployment rate since we started recording is like 16.9%. A lot of people are not working. The lowest it's ever been is 2.2%. Now it's just right around 3.2%. So from a headline data point, everyone would see that data point because we collect that data on, the number of people who are working versus the number of people we have in the state overall. So when you hear 16.9%, that high unemployment rate, most people would say, man, that's pretty bad, right? Yeah, that's bad. If when you hear a 2.2 unemployment rate compared to that, your first thought, that's pretty good. Because the people working. Employers will tell you that 2.2% is not a good number because it tells you that we have an economy that there are not enough people going in and out of the workforce. So top scale number, is something good, and we need to track that 2.2% we need to track. But when you really dig into it, the number that's not tracked is why is it at 2.2 and the struggle that employers are having. And then that's when sort of, when you talk about the transparency and what the experts can't tell you, because they're trying to tell you on the large scale. That's one of the examples that popped in my mind as you were speaking. You said, can I tell you a few words?
Yeah, no, we'll get to that audience.
Okay, so I love examples like this. So one of the interesting things about the unemployment rate is it's a measure of what percent of people are seeking jobs, who get jobs. And so one of the ways the unemployment rate can fall is that people give up on jobs. There are a ton of other examples in this space. And this is just a small thing, just pay attention to. So here are two of my favorite examples. The most devastating one. I went down this whole path. This is probably This American Life episode about quantitative policing in New York. And one of the interesting things about quantitative policing in New York is it centers around something called closure rate. Closure rate is the number of reported crimes where the case is open then closed. And Commissioner Salaries were topic here. It turns out, if you see The Wired about this, it turns out that the first thing that happened when they started measuring quantitative policing is indeed they drove out a lot of corruption issues in the system. 10 years later, what you found was police commissioners, they call it juking the stats. And here are two ways that they systematically juke the stats. You can make your case closure rate better if you make crimes harder to report. That is, it's more annoying to report a fine to DO people that's more reported. And then also juke the stats by finding that you open and close a case immediately, like in fact violation stop. So a reason why traffic violation, more resources presents traffic violation stops was because it makes the stats look better. Here's another one. This is recorded in Estlin and Sauer's Engine Anxiety. They documented this case. So one of the things that makes you look bad on the SEO report is your acceptance rate, right? The thinner your acceptance rate, the smaller that number, the better it will receive university are. So recruiters were told to actively encourage people to apply because they knew would be rejected in order to that set. So that kind of thing, I mean, those are kind of like things going on, but those are more examples, kind of the veil between the thing itself and the readiness.
That's great. I have so many questions that I didn't get to ask, but we have a super interesting and diverse audience here today of like people like nonprofits, students, professors from the community. So I want to start Q&A. And so one thing I would like to request though is that if you have a question, you raise your hand and you wait until Jeff is able to get to you with the mic, because sometimes people are hard of hearing and this helps them, but also we are live streaming this. And if you just shout your question out, the live stream audience won't be able to hear your question. So just kind of, wait that awkward couple seconds that it's going to take Jeff to get to you. So go ahead. Yeah. Who's first? Rich.
Check.
And
thank you so much, all of you, for that. Thi and the rest, if you can sort of address, I guess my question comes from one of the things you said in my comments there, Thi, that there's a problem of scale. It can be okay when institutions, they have to use data, it can be good to use data, but we don't want to internalize it at a personal scale. And so there's this problem of scale. But it seems like in your response to Fred's points there, you were pointing to problems with institutional use of data and institutions changing their practices and self-understanding on the basis of the data they gather and how it's data being used to put. And so I'm, in my sort of thinking, interested as much in how institutions get shaped by the ways they gather data and use it and what's left out of those measures, as I am in the individual ethical question, what we do in our lives. Can you say some more about that, any of you or all of you, about how do you see data changing institutions, not necessarily in positive ways. I mean, I'm sure in some cases you've mentioned positive ways that they've been used, but how over time does it degrade? They've been simplified in these ways. Thanks.
Sure, I can provide a little perspective on this. As you were talking, and actually as I was hearing the comments of my fellow panelists, this was coming to my mind. One of the spaces where I think I see the use case you're talking about, where you're using data and it's actually driving institutional decision making. In this case, not necessarily in a positive intent, but maybe not positive outcome. In the space of hiring decisions. And there is a lot of very slick, very accessible, very powerful technology that can be used to make hiring decisions for employers. So if I have 100 candidates for a job, we have very, very sophisticated technologies that can be leveraged here, where that technology goes in, looks at resumes, looks at the submission, gathers information. In some cases, it's using versions of artificial intelligence. There's machine learning that's involved here, where it can learn about candidates and positions over time. And it is leveraging data and harnessing data for that particular purpose, for the decision of deciding who moves to the next step. And it's that simple. I have 100 candidates. I can't move 100 candidates to my next step. How do those candidates get to the next step? And so what we find is, first of all, there is an allure to it, because there is a way to very quickly harness large amounts of information in a way that it would take humans much longer to do. So you get a great algorithm developed, and that algorithm, it's firing along and it's doing great stuff. It's using a lot of quantitative standards. It is using a lot of data-driven decision-making. Things as simple as what kind of words are being used in a resume. There are ways to game the system. I love the discussion about trying to game systems here. I mean, this is a way to game the system, is using certain language in the resume can sort of fool those algorithms sometimes and end up giving you a more advantageous position in theory than maybe if you were a candidate who didn't optimize your resume for purposes of an algorithm. But going to your point, one of the impacts of that, and this is something that we're working through within the employment community, compliance community, is we now have government regulators saying, whoa, wait a second, right? You're making decisions about your 100 resumes. You're deciding who's number 1 on that list, who's number 100 on that list, and you might be making decisions about who you grant an interview to and who you ultimately end up hiring. You're making decisions based on data-driven analytics that are run by technology, artificial intelligence, and you are making hiring decisions that will affect individual candidates in a way that can, in some circumstances, and has in some circumstances, at least allegedly, in some cases that we're seeing play out, result in, if not direct discrimination against specific groups of individuals, what we would call a disparate impact. So on the face, it looks very not like there's no way this is a discriminatory decision, but when we drill down into the numbers, who's getting to numbers 1 through 5? Who's consistently or more frequently at numbers 95 to 100? So you're using data, you're leveraging it, it feels like a good thing. In theory, there is absolutely no intent on the part of the organization to implement an openly discriminatory practice, but at the same time, you can, in certain circumstances, result in a disparate impact that does arise to the level of discrimination. And so we have the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission coming out and saying, listen, when you're using these algorithms, when you're leveraging this technology, when you're using this data to help you more efficiently make those decisions about who you're going to interview, you have to remember, if it's creating a discriminatory impact in some way, a disparate impact that is unlawful under the standards of Title VII, for example, you're on the hook, employers. You have to know how that algorithm works. You have to know how it makes the decisions, because it is driving legal risk to your organization by using something that feels so good, right? It feels great. It's fast. They're great platforms. You can look at all of the wonderful bells and whistles that are on them. The data feels very certain. It's that very quantitative, like I can look at this in plenty of numbers. But when you get to the end of it, you've got number one, you're eliminating that nuance that we've been talking about, the complexity of who a candidate is. And anyone who's ever done any sort of recruitment activity, you know that there are people who walk into those interviews and you meet these people and they do not look bright and shiny on a piece of paper, and they are fabulous. Superstars, rock stars, who maybe just didn't pick the right words on their resume. And so it speaks directly to that idea that people as individuals are far more complex than a technology that you're using to read through your 100 resumes.
I love talking about HR and algorithms. I've been worried a lot about something that I think a lot of you may know. In your heart, I think many of us know that Amazon search rankings for quality of products have gotten much worse over the last 10 years. When Amazon started, they felt like, oh yeah, whatever came on the top of the search, got a lot of starters. It's pretty good. Now I get stuff for my kid that breaks in a week. And the best that a lot of people in the space have figured out is early on, the algorithm was pretty good at finding reviews to figure out what was good. And then companies figured out that the algorithm was targeting very specific qualities that they gamed it. And so what's rising to the top is now, I think it's very similar, like crap where people have spent less time on the product and more time on maybe the Amazon algorithm. So there's a worry. I have a big worry. This is just gonna happen everywhere, right? But whenever you have a single targetable algorithm that looks at a smaller number of qualities, then you can get active gaming that algorithm. You get Corey Doctor has an article about this, and he calls it the certification of everything. I'm really worried about it. But I think more directly to your point. So there's a lot of stuff in Data Reporter about this. And one of the things he worries about is that there's qualitative reasoning and quantitative reasoning. And I'm really happy to hear you talk about the balance in your organization. But in a lot of organizations, what we're really worried about is that administrators typically prefer quantitative reasoning because, I mean, there's not a polite way to put this. It doesn't put them on the hook as responsible. So if you make a qualitative judgment, you've inserted yourself in the judgment process, and you just screws up, you're responsible. If you have a quantified piece of reasoning, then you can say, it's not me, it's the numbers. So I think, for example, in a lot of cases, I should defer to the lawyers here, but in many cases, it seems like if you can point to some strict, like, look, we just admitted the students that have the highest GPAs, you're less liable for various lawsuits than if you inserted yourself as having made a qualitative judgment. So there seems to be a procedure by which things that we can count easily rise to the top of decision-making processes, even when you have the sense that they're not the most important thing. So the center of Data Reporter's book is this is going to sound really weird, but a thrilling 3-chapter history of the rise of the cost-benefit analysis. And one of the things we find from the cost-benefit analysis is that there are certain things that are much easier to estimate costs for, much harder to estimate costs for, right? And one of the things you find in civic projects, it becomes much easier, using the cost-benefit analysis tends to point you towards things like the protect from property damage. That's pretty easy to quantify, but it doesn't target, it really does poorly on projects that target things like beauty or quality of life or playing mass and make the kids happier, right? It's going to tend to prefer things like, we're going to build this thing to make sure the city doesn't flood. It points you away from things like awesome playgrounds and community centers for kids, because those are much harder to attach a cost benefit number to if it's that you point to a mechanical data collection procedure behind, right? Lorraine Daston, who's this incredible historian, says there's a deep difference between two senses of a rule. There's the older sense of a rule that we had. She calls the rules principle, where a rule is an abstract generalization that requires judgment and expertise to apply, that it is exceptions. And then what she calls an algorithm, which is a mechanical thing that anyone can put to apply, that everyone will apply in the same way. She then by the algorithmic conceptual rule is about 150 years old. It's pretty recent, right? And so one way to put it is the porting worry is that we're moving towards more algorithmic decision-making processes, partially because there's really powerful information there, but partially because we can avoid inserting ourselves as responsible beings who made a judgment call and can step back.
One of the gate. Lots of the question. And while Jeff's making clearly talking, down here. And while Jeff's making his way, I'm gonna do some more self-promotion. It's a learning Baston was on. And he's talking about rules as well. So if you want to hear more about what he's just talking about, check out the show.
I was wondering how you embed a critical race theory in your research. So I heard you talk about how data can be used to undermine or give less discretion to experts. How do you challenge that in a world where a lot of the experts historically and firmly are white men?
Let me tell you about one. There's a part of the transparency paper that I didn't talk about. This is the part about LGBTQ alliance groups in my university. So, LGBTQ alliance groups. So, when people imagine transparency, they often imagine, look, there are evil politicians, and we, the good-hearted people, are going to make them be transparent. We're going to make them be good. What I saw at my university was an LGBTQ support alliance group that, in its transparency practices, had to make its budget decisions line item respectable to the Utah State Legislature. And they had a line item for safe space. Utah State Legislature, their board of directors, none of whom, by the way, rejected the line item. The reason is because, one way to put it, is because I think if you grow up here in Utah, you have a special understanding of the need for safe spaces that's not available to Utah in general. And so that's a case where I think transparency washes out a certain special understanding. So the one way to put it, this is, see if this makes sense. I think a lot of people, a lot of progressive left-leaning people have to admit two things. One is this thing that a lot of people call stamping epistemology, like the idea that certain oppressed groups have special understandings. The end of the day is transparency. You have to make everything justifiable to everyone. The thing I'm saying is they're often in tension, and especially when the public in general has certain biases built in, right? Then transparency procedures can push those biases down. So this is well studied in, I'm not sure how many people study the algorithmic bias literature, but one of the things that people worry about in algorithmic bias literature is that there's a systematic bias in the data collection procedure. And then when you systematize that into a machine learning algorithm, you put that bias in the back. Here are two cases, both of which tear up. So Yelp guides a lot of people with restaurants. Yelp is largely used by the major user base is white men between 20 and 35. And so, for example, in Los Angeles, Yelp is much better at reporting Mexican restaurants in white, wealthy areas than reporting Mexican restaurants in the Mexican part of town in a direct counter. Right? But you get what's called the looping effect. So now all the traffic goes to those areas, that reports restaurants in those areas, and underreports restaurants in the created Mexican what parts of town. That's built in. The most terrifying thing, one last thing. Here's the most terrifying looping effect I know. It's very well studied by people with algorithmic bias. Here's what it looks like. So there's a program called Compass that tells police where to go. So it's algorithmic policing, and it tells police for which areas to go to based on past crime reports where crimes like that happen. But this means any bias that's been built into the data gets looped into. So if in a city like LA, where police have systematically hyper-policed black areas who reported more crimes there than white areas, right? Then machine learning algorithm programmed on that data will tend to send police to black areas where they will see more crimes and report them, and those will be fed into the database, and the algorithm will enter a feedback loop and continue to send police more heavily to those areas. So does that make sense? So that's a case where a past structural bias that led to a biased data set gets built into the program. But now people can say, and this is the word for the algorithm bias literature, that's not us making a decision, that's the machine, it's objective, it didn't make the call. But even if the machine learning procedure is entirely perfect, if the data set that's been collected on, trained on, has any bias in past data collection, and we know that there's systematic bias in policing act in LA, then the output is deeply worrisome. So this problem shows up all from the algorithm. Is that this viewers?
Yeah, and for summer, like, well, that was like a goal. And completely agree. Sorry. The question I had was more so like your statement about reducing transparency, providing more trust in the expert. There are efforts like, and also like your statement about they reflect on do the job showing you advocates. Something that I'm kind of curious about is like there are also a lot of data efforts that when you are intentional about those efforts that provide a voice and visibility into communities that have been underserved. And I think that there's power within that movement data. And so something like this, but then the flip side of the argument of like if we are supposed to trust the experts so much, and the education of these institutions looking down can, like you said, build systems of bias, then there's power of data in that other direction as well, of collecting that to be able to show this.
Absolutely. I mean, this is the deep dilemma. In any case where there's any bias or corruption or any problem with the experts, transparency is good. In any case where the experts are doing something well and non-experts don't understand why, transparency is bad. We don't always know which is which, then we have to decide. So my claim is just this profound trade-off, because there's something good about both transparent. There's something deeply worrisome and deeply good about transparency, and what makes it so is indestructible. That's my word.
Jeff, do you have time for one more, maybe a lightning question? Somebody, maybe a student has like a super quick question. You haven't heard from any students yet. Or anybody else who has a lightning quick question. I did. Yes.
Thanks for your comments, everyone. My question, I guess mainly for T, but and with ideas. What is wrong with us? It's a question about human nature that we so easily internalize that data into our values. So like the game, I get the game situation. It's like, okay, hey, I don't want to win. Of course, temporarily, I try to score the points, however, whatever way. If my salary is tied to some data, then you can see how you would go for that. But I'm struck by the Fitbit example in particular. What is wrong with us that we obsess with the Fitbit and make that our values?
A really quick answer is that it transitions things from a state of uncertainty, a hard to justify, and difficult, nauseating justifications, so state of clarity justifications. It feels easier to do with this try and make fun support.
Well, thank you, the freebies, so much. This was fascinating. And so I think that's the end of this event. So thank you all so much for coming. Jeff, I don't know if you want to stick me anything in closing, but yeah, thank you so much. Have a good afternoon. And